Right, I think we'll get started. So welcome everyone to this Transition Zero webinar. My name is Matt Gray. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Transition Zero. We're excited to have you all here, and thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us. So today we're going to be talking about a recently released report on modeling 24/7 carbon-free electricity in India. It is the first in a series of reports that we're going to be releasing on this important topic. In terms of the agenda today, I'm joined by my colleague, Irfan Mohamed, who is the lead modeler on this report. Irfan will be presenting the modeling methodology and some of the key findings of the report. We also have a fantastic panel of Indian experts who are going to provide some reflections on the reports and answer some questions that I will pose to them. The panelists include Vibhuti Garg, a director of South Asia for the Institute of Energy and Financial Analysis, Matthew Smith, the head of energy solutions from Serentica, and last but not least, Shailesh Telang, the head of APAC from EnergyTag. Just some housekeeping. We have allocated 10 minutes for Q&A at the end of this webinar, but we would encourage you to answer or ask questions at any time. You can do so by hitting the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We will either answer those questions straight away or we will deal with them at the end of the webinar. For those of you who do not know TransitionZero, we are a climate tech not-for-profit established in 2021 to support policymakers in low to middle income countries with energy transition planning. We do three things. The main thing that we do is no-code software for energy transition planning. We also produce a number of open data sets which make our software more useful. And then lastly, we have market analysts who support our users and stakeholders in the countries that we operate in. We target policymakers in low to middle income countries because they have historically struggled with the cost and complexity of commercial software packages. What we provide is open, it's no code, and perhaps most importantly, it is free. Before I hand it over to Irfan to dive into the report, I want to just talk quickly about what 24/7 CFE is, why it's important, and then let you know about the publication schedule for the other reports. So 24/7 CFE is a demand side measure. It is a way to purchase and account for clean electricity on an hourly basis. 24/7 CFE is becoming an increasingly important topic. The main reason it is becoming important is because hourly matching is mentioned in the proposed revisions to the Scope 2 accounting guidance under the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. For those of you who do not know about the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, it is the gold standard for emissions reporting by companies. At TransitionZero, we believe in locally led least cost energy transition planning. And we see 24/7 CFE as one measure that can help support that outcome. In terms of the publication schedules, so we released India a couple of weeks ago, and we plan to release similar reports for Japan, Taiwan, Malaysia, and Singapore in September. Once we publish the final report, we will also be making the models associated with these reports publicly available under an open source license. That those models will be available under in our GitHub repository. And also to mention Scenario Builder, our no-code modeling software, we are going to bring on India onto Scenario Builder. So please do register for access, and we will share access to Scenario Builder. And also to mention, subject to resourcing, we hope to bring on a CFE feature, which will allow any user who has access to Scenario Builder to replicate what we have done with these reports, which is something we are particularly excited about. And I think there should be a link in the chat to give you access to register for Scenario Builder. And then just lastly, we would also like to acknowledge those academics who have pioneered some of the modeling behind 24/7 CFE. So the reports that we have done for India and what we plan to do for other Asian markets is built on a body of research from universities such as TU Berlin and Princeton University, and we are very grateful for the support that they have provided us, and also just to mention the models that we have developed are based on the PIPESA modeling package. Irfan, over to you.
Thanks, Matt. Hi, everyone. So as Matt has mentioned, I'm the modeler for South Asia here at TransitionZero, and I'm the lead modeler for this report. Over the next 25 minutes, I will be taking you through our report. Just bear with me while I get my slides up. Wonderful. So over the next 25 minutes, I'll just be taking you through what CFE is in a bit more detail, how we modeled it, and what our main findings were. These are mostly a summary of what you may have seen in our report already, but this will be maybe a high-level takeaway and a few more things explained in a bit more detail. So, as you may or may not know, the GHG accounting protocol is evolving, and this may require companies to report Scope 2 emissions on an hourly basis, which means that what we have right now is roughly kind of three different situations. We have commercial and industrial consumers in a kind of do-nothing situation, where for the most part they don't do any kind of emissions reporting or emissions accounting. And what they do is they will be consuming grid electricity, and that grid electricity will have some portion of it based on carbon-free energy and some portion of it based on carbon-based energy. Now, when CNI consumers start to move towards emissions reporting or accounting, offsetting, one of the most common practices that we see in India and across the world is annual matching. And this is where a CNI consumer will procure power, typically through a power purchase agreement or PPA, in order to match their annual demand with an equivalent amount of clean generation. So this means that if they have 100 units of 100 units of consumption throughout the year, they'll be matching that with 100 units of solar generation or wind generation across the year. Crucially, what this means is that on an hour-by-hour basis, you'll end up with the reality where you'll have mismatches between your clean generation and your supply due to the intermittent nature of renewables. So at any given hour, you'll probably have a mix of your clean PPA, carbon-free grid supply, and a carbon-based grid supply. Other hours of the year, you will have an excess of your PPA because you'll have maybe a daytime peak of solar and not enough demand to match it. The third situation, which we're exploring in a bit more detail in this report, is where CNI consumers voluntarily move towards a 24/7 round-the-clock or carbon-free energy approach, where at every hour of the year, they will target a specific CFE score. So for example, if they target an 80% CFE score, they will aim to have 80% of their energy throughout the year from carbon-free sources. And that may be carbon-free from their PPA, it may be from the grid, if the grid is clean enough to allow them to meet that target score, and then the remainder from carbon-based grid supply. And as we reach 100% CFE, what CNI consumers would be aiming to do is have all of their energy coming from carbon-free sources, whether that's from their own procured PPA with solar or wind and batteries, for example, or whether that's from the grid, again, if the grid is clear enough. The other key principles just to keep in mind when we're thinking about CFE is that we are aiming for CFE to be local to the same grid zone. We are aiming for CFE procured capacity to be additional to the grid, so we don't double count things like NDC targets or the 500 gigawatts target that India has. And obviously this has to be matched hour by hour. So now that we've looked a bit more into what CFE is, I just want to spend a few minutes talking about our study approach and how we modeled CFE in India, just so we can all appreciate the findings and maybe engage a bit more critically with the discussion later on. So the first thing we did was we developed a representative NDC compliant 2030 grid. And what this means is, in practice, we started with a 2023 grid, so the known grid of 2023, with its known generation mix of coal, solar, etc. On top of that, we layered things like expected national policies like NDCs and capacity targets, expected growth rates of different technologies, demand projections, technology costs, etc. And we arrive at a 2030 grid, which is NDC compliant by 2030. So it meets the, well, India has already met its 50% capacity from non-fossil fuels. It meets that target, it meets the emissions share, and it meets a non-NDC target of 500 gigawatts from non-fossil fuels. But the grid is also technically feasible / realistic in that it doesn't build ridiculous amounts of a particular technology, and it doesn't build capital-intensive plants like nuclear or hydro that isn't already in the known pipeline or reported by the government. It's worth noting that our 2030 grid is not the main focus of our study, but it definitely does affect how CFE as a policy works and its viability or non-viability. So I would just urge you to keep that in mind as we go through the rest of the report. So now that we have the 2030 grid, we can create a dispatch model with hourly granularity and modeling at the grid zone. And what this means is for each of the 5 grid zones in India North, Northeast, West, South, and East, we can simulate hour by hour which electricity generating technologies dispatch, how much coal there is generating, how much solar, water, etc., in order to meet the projected demand in any given hour and in order to meet the constraints that we put on the system. So given that system, we then test different policies to see the to see their effect on costs, emissions, and other system metrics. And these policies are, of course, our annual matching and hourly matching. So the first thing we do is we cycle through each of the 5 grid zones and we assign 5% of demand to CNI consumers who are participating in clean electricity matching. And this 5% is just representative of some portion of the CNI consumer segment that is moving towards decarbonization. For this 5% of demand, we model that 5%, this participating CNI demand, as either following an annual or an hourly matching regime. What happens is that CNI consumers have to procure PPAs in order to be supplied with that clean electricity. And those PPAs are then expected to trigger additional capacity build. So additional solar, additional wind, batteries, etc., as required for them to meet the annual or the hourly matching targets. Now, how much capacity gets built in a model, that's something that we let our model and we let Pipestar optimize. So I'll look at the most cost optimal way to build the required capacity in order for this participating CNI demand to meet its annual or its hourly matching targets. Finally, we aggregate these grid zone level results together and assess the impact on the schemes on consumers as well as the wider system. So before I go into the results, I think it would be useful to give kind of an executive summary, a key high-level findings from what we found in our study. Now, what we found is that carbon-free electricity or hourly matching or around the clock, however you want to term it, can bring benefits to both the system and CNI consumers over and above annual matching. And the reason this is the case is a number of reasons. 70% CFE, so when participating CNI demand targets 70% carbon-free energy around the clock, that can provide multiple benefits to the power sector in 2030 over and above annual matching. It can be delivered at lower cost to annual matching. It can deliver lower emissions than annual matching. And for CNI consumers, it provides more energy security because of the prices they have locked in through the PPA. They've got increased reliability of energy supply through the PPA, and it's more reliable than annual matching. When CNI consumers participate in any level of CFE, there are system benefits. And what I mean by that is, and this is something that we'll go into as we go through the findings here, is that as India's grid gets greener, as we put more renewables in the system, we have to be more thoughtful and more intentional about how we integrate further renewables. We can't just keep expecting to put extra solar and extra wind onto the system and expect to get the same level of cost reductions or emissions reductions. What's going to happen is you're going to get curtailment, unwanted market effects, zero price arrays. So policies like granular accounting and hourly matching help to support a more effective and a more clever integration of renewables onto the wider system. Finally, what we found in India is that solar and wind and batteries form the backbone of a successful CFE portfolio. Because India already has the benefit of having very low capex costs for solar and a increasingly maturing battery sector, what this means is that CFE, even at high levels, is definitely within reach. There are still some barriers to overcome, but India is already very well placed for CNI consumers to start looking towards annual hourly matching and granular accounting. So let's look a bit more into the results in more detail. So the first thing we're going to look at is net system costs. And this is one of the main findings from our report. What we're looking at here is a graph of the net system costs under each of the annual and hourly matching schemes in comparison to our do-nothing approach. So what are the changes in capital costs, which are in green, and these indicate where you're having to build more solar, more onshore, etc. And what are the changes in the operational costs in orange, which you'll notice are all negative. And that's because this, what's happening here is as you're building out more renewables with their cheap marginal and operating costs, that is helping to displace expensive fossil fuel generators and expensive generating technologies, which results in savings to the system. In our study, what we're expecting in terms of the flow of money is that we're expecting the capital costs, the portion in green, in positive, to be paid for by the CNI consumer through their PPAs, and they will see other benefits. But the segment in orange are savings that we expect to see to the system and to the grid as a whole. That line in the middle that you see is the net system benefits, which is a sum of the capex and opex changes. Now, our first finding is that 70% CFE can be delivered at lower cost to the grid, 35% cheaper, in fact, than annual matching. And there's two main reasons for that. One is your capital cost of 27,000 crore is obviously lower than under annual matching. And that's because you actually have to build less capacity because you're being more careful about the synergy between renewables and batteries. And again, we'll go into that in a bit more detail in the following slides. The second reason why it's cheaper is that it is offsetting or creating more grid savings than under annual matching. And again, the reason why that is the case is because under hourly matching, you're using your renewables more effectively and helping to displace more expensive coal generators, and you're doing it more effectively than you're doing it under annual matching. And you'll also be displacing carbon emissions through these expensive coal generators. And what this means is that you have a lower net system cost compared to annual matching. Even if we push that target up to 80% CFE, we still see about 9% system savings compared to annual matching. And even though the capital cost is a lot higher than under annual matching, again, it's offset by this increase in operational cost savings. And we actually see operational cost savings continue to go down as you go higher up the CFE scale. As you target higher and higher levels of clean hourly matching, what's happening is that you are continuing to displace more expensive generators off the grid and continuing to displace more emissions off the grid. Now, if we look a bit more at the green bars, so the capital expenditure in a bit more detail, and we start to look at how that's split between the different technologies, the first thing we notice is when we have annual matching, all of your costs are going to just building a bunch of solar. On annual matching, all you're concerned with is building enough clean generation to match your consumption throughout the year. You're not really concerned about matching it hour by hour. You're not actually that concerned about making sure that the clean generation you procure actually reaches the CNI load. And therefore, the easiest way to do it is just to build a bunch of solar, which is the cheapest way to do this in India right now. Now, in contrast, when you go to your CFE or hourly matching scenarios, you have to be a bit more clever about what the cost optimal way of building solar, wind, and batteries are in order to deliver carbon-free energy reliably throughout the day for your CNI load. And that's where you start to see this more even split between solar, batteries, and wind. Now, the interesting thing is that on a cost per megawatt basis, these costs remain relatively static across CFE target scores. And what I mean by that is when you look at per megawatts or per 10 megawatts or whatever of a solar, wind, and batteries, how much it actually costs in your CFE target scores, you'll see that it actually is the same or even slightly goes down as you go up CFE target scores. The reason why it's obviously much more expensive at 100% CFE compared to say 90% CFE is you have to build a lot more capacity. Even though each megawatt of the capacity is roughly the same price, you have to build more of it because as you reach higher CFE target scores, you can't be as reliant on the grid with its likely carbon intensive coal or gas generators. And therefore, you have to build out more of your own PPA and you have to build more capacity. And that's exactly what we're seeing here. So this is the graph of your required capacity build out when this 5% of nationwide demand starts to move towards annual hourly matching. So you'll see this is a very similarly shaped graph to the cost graph. The previous graph was system costs or capital costs, and this graph is looking at the capacity that you have to build. And the reason it's the same shape is because solar, wind, and batteries are all roughly in the same order of magnitude in terms of how much they cost. So there's not any huge skewing in the shape of the graph. Again, what we see is that 70% CFE here requires much less capacity than annual matching. And again, like I've been saying, it's because under annual matching, you are being a lot more intentional and a lot more effective and a lot more optimal about how you're combining your solar, your wind, and your batteries in order to deliver carbon-free energy around the clock in a reliable way. And what we are seeing is that typically the best pairing of clean generation with batteries is about 1 megawatt of generation with around 2 megawatt hours of storage or half a megawatt of storage. In this study, we've looked at batteries with a 4-hour duration. And that ratio remains quite constant as you go up the scale or as you go up the CFE target scores. The real challenge, of course, lies in decarbonizing those last 10% of hours. Those last 10% of hours, going from 90% CFE to 100% CFE, almost requires a doubling of capacity and investment. And that's because those last 10% of hours are likely to be those hours in the year where you have very little sunlight or very little wind, and you will have to overbuild both your generation and your battery storage in order to see you through those long periods of time where you don't have that fresh, clean generation coming in. And so you have to overbuild to kind of like have enough energy in reserve, essentially. When we're looking at the oversizing ratio between kind of your peak demand of your CFE and how much you're having to build in order to accommodate the demand and that peak demand, that oversizing ratio is about 3 times at CFE 70% and about 10 times at 100%. If you're just looking at the generators and not the storage, that ratio is more like two times to 6 times. So I talked about this kind of increase in the last 10% of hours. And there are probably more than two ways, but there are two ways you can kind of flatten that last 10% of hours or make those last 10% of hours easier to decarbonize. The first way is by incorporating clean dispatchable technologies like gas CCS or hydrogen co-firing, ammonia co-firing. And what that allows you to do is you have clean dispatchable technology, which you can deploy during those hours where you have no sunlight or you have no wind. Unfortunately, we haven't modeled that quite yet here in India, but it's something we are planning to do. The other thing you can do is look at long duration energy storage. And that's another way that you can kind of buffer those long periods of no renewable generation and save up your solar and your wind from, say, a week ago to see you through a week of renewables famine. We have tested long duration energy storage, and what we found is that right now it has a limited part to play. When we let long duration energy storage build in our model, the cost optimal solution was only to build about 200 megawatts. But that 200 megawatts, if I go back to the last graph, displaced or brought your 61 gigawatts of batteries down to 58 gigawatts. So it's having a large effect relatively. That 200 megawatts is displacing 15 times its capacity in regular lithium ion batteries. But currently it's limited by its high capital costs. And if long duration energy storage and CFE is going to become more viable, there needs to be some kind of technological cost reduction or some kind of supporting policy to allow long duration storage to be more viable for the CNI consumers. So the next thing I want to look at is emissions. Now I mentioned emissions briefly earlier, and what you're looking at here is the emissions rate of the system as a whole. And what we're finding is that hourly matching is far more effective at driving emissions reductions than annual matching. And that is surprising, or should be surprising, given that if you look at the capacity built, we built a whopping 71 gigawatts of solar here. But when we look at the emissions reductions, it's barely like, I think less than 1%, if I done my maths correctly, I can't remember. And that's much not as high as we would expect. Whereas when you look at hourly matching, you can see that emissions reductions are much lower. And again, this goes back to the point I mentioned where under hourly matching, you're using much more effective use of your renewables and your storage to effectively deliver clean energy throughout the day, to effectively displace coal generation throughout the day, and continue to reduce your emissions. When you get to 100% CFE, that 5% of demand, that participating CNI demand that's moved to CFE, sorry, has reduced total emissions by 7%. Now, the other way we can look at the effectiveness of emissions reductions is you'll notice that there's a right-hand axis on this graph, and that is mapping carbon abatement costs. And carbon abatement is essentially measuring your effectiveness of your emissions reduction schemes. So it's your total cost of your intervention divided by the emissions reduced. And the lower that number, the more effective your carbon abatement. And what we're finding is that annual matching is about 3 times more expensive than hourly matching to reduce the same level of carbon. And again, that's all to do with the technologies and the effectiveness of technologies that are being displaced under annual and hourly matching. This is the message I want to hammer home. Hourly matching really makes use of your renewable generators in a way that annual matching does not. Before I go to kind of the closing thoughts, I wanted to show you perhaps how this is happening in practice, how 100% CFE actually works from the viewpoint of the CNI consumer. So what we have in front of us is a dispatch plot. A dispatch plot is essentially, this is just an indicative day, March 18th, 2030. What it's showing is hour by hour, how much electricity is being produced from your different generators, solar, wind, batteries, in order to meet your load, which is here in purple. So this load here. This is a CNI consumer under 100% CFE. So they're completely reliant on their own PPAs, which is why you only have solar, wind, and battery generating, and they're not using any energy from the grid. So just to help you understand exactly what's happening here, I'm going to point out a few key things about how clean generation through the PPA is reaching the CNI consumer. Firstly, you've got solar and wind both serving the load during the day and then charging up the batteries during the day. So this portion here is it meeting the C and I load, making sure there's enough electricity for whatever your CNI demand is. And then the excess here is being used to charge up your batteries, and it's excess because the dispatch is negative, which means it's charging up the battery. Now, that excess means your batteries are nice and charged, which means that during the evening and the morning hours, you can see that the area in blue represents the batteries serving the load during the evening and the mornings and making sure it has enough carbon-free energy to last it throughout the night. Finally, periods of excess solar, battery, and storage are sold back to the grid at times of most value, i.e. during the morning and evening hours. A couple last things. When we look at the energy balance for the CFE loads, so when we look at how much electricity is being consumed from the grid versus how much is being consumed from the PPA versus how much is being sold back, like we've mentioned earlier, under 100% annual matching, you have a lot of this excess electricity, which is wasted and has to be sold back to the grid because of those mismatches between supply and demand. Whereas on annual matching, whereas on the hourly matching, you see very little of the sellback. It's only at 100% where you see the sellback happening because of the level of overbuilding required. Similarly, when we look at curtailment of PPA generators, you can see that curtailment is actually very manageable up until maybe 99% CFE. Again, hourly matching, because it's a cost optimal approach, you are trying to make best use of the PPA procurement that you have, and you want to waste as little as possible. Now, when you reach 99 and 100% CFE, because of the level of oversizing required, what you're seeing is curtailment. And you can actually see it in this graph here, these flat areas where solar could be charging on the batteries more, is being curtailed because the batteries are full or whatever. And you are kind of losing all this excess energy here that you could be usefully using. And that's just because right now the battery and long duration battery costs are such that it is cheaper to waste the energy than it is to build more batteries to store that energy. So closing thoughts. You can read a lot more about this in the report if you're interested, but there are obviously going to be limitations and caveats with our study. Firstly, our choice of reference scenario. We picked an NDC compliant grid by 2030. But of course, forecasts are always uncertain. The potential demand and generation in 2030 could be very different. There can be an open question about whether India meets its NDC targets in 2030. There could be other policy targets that come into play and other sensitivities like weather sensitivities and fuel price sensitivities. We have modeled a CFE as a policy in the way that we think is most faithful to the current Indian market, but there are lots of things to consider on top of that, such as grid surcharges, tariffs, state policies, etc. And there are obviously steps that have to go from this modeling to informing policy making. And finally, looking beyond India in the future, TransitionZero are looking at the same question in other geographies, and we can't take for granted that the conclusions from India are applicable to other countries as well. So we have to keep that in mind. And similarly with the impact of new technologies like gas CCS, we have to also evaluate and think about how that can affect CFE and how that varies again between different countries, because these technologies have different impacts and different viabilities in India versus other geographies. I just want to repeat the acknowledgements, as Matt mentioned in the start, to TU Berlin, Princeton, and reports from the IEA. I also want to thank everyone on the panel who helped feed into early versions of this report, as well as the Vasudha Foundation and other reviewers who chose to remain anonymous, but whose insights were invaluable. With that, I'll hand back to Matt to start off the panel discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Irfan, and thank you for staying on time. You were perfect in that regard.
Wonderful.
Right, so I'm going to share my screen again. Hopefully everyone can see my screen. What we're going to do now is move on to a panel discussion. I'm going to ask each of the panelists to speak for 1 to 2 minutes, giving their reflections on the report. I'm going to call on Vibhuti first to come forward. So Vibhuti, if you could turn on your camera, and yeah, over to you.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. First of all, congratulations to all the authors for and TransitionZero for doing such a detailed modeling work on how India can achieve 24/7 power carbon free, especially in a country like India. It's really, really important, which is experiencing, I would say, substantial increase in electricity demand growth, on an year-on-year basis. So it's not just a question of kind of replacing the existing supply sources, but also how do we kind of ensure that any additional new demand that is getting added to the grid is also kind of met through more sustainable energy choices, more clean energy choices. So also, one other thing that India is also experiencing is a change in the load profiles. We are seeing now the peak not happening like in the morning hours, but that has shifted to like afternoon peaks and evening peaks, which kind of also there is an upside that at least the afternoon peaks can be met through solar. So while Irfan just represented that the annual matching would largely mean I would say more installation of solar. But then if you start looking at the load profiles, it does make sense as well. And especially for residential consumers, solar could play a big role, not for CNI consumers who have more constant kind of a load. Coming very specific to this study, the thing that I kind of found most interesting was kind of demonstrating the fact that 70% of CFE for CNI consumers can result in huge savings, both operational cost savings and also the system cost, as well as the annual abatement cost, which was coming out to be much cheaper. I believe 3 times is what you mentioned, Irfan, if I remember correctly. So again, clearly demonstrating that, rather than not doing anything at all, just because the cost of 100% CFE is much, much higher, but at least you can start somewhere, start with 70% hourly matching, and, then gradually shift to 100% matching. Definitely, we are seeing the benefits. We are seeing, with the decline in the cost and improving technologies where the CUFs are increasing, we are not too far away from, when the system costs will be much, much cheaper, even with including long duration energy storage or other, I would say, demand side management techniques that we will be able to kind of demonstrate huge cost savings even for 100% CFE. So yeah, but let's start somewhere, and 70% definitely makes a greater use case for all the CNI consumers to shift to hourly matching. So over to you, man.
Thank you, Vibhuti. I'll now hand it over to Matthew.
Hi, Matt. Hi, team. Congratulations on the report. Yeah, so here at Serentica, we've already got 4 gigawatts of wind solar storage under construction, all for providing these round-the-clock products of different firmness. So, this is something very close to the heart of what we do here. Especially my team, what I generally am doing is trying to find the exact combination of wind, solar, storage, how much we can price it, what are the sort of terms and conditions that give a good solution for us and our customers, or both government entities and also CNI consumers. But a very timely report, and I think India is a great market for it because we're the most advanced in the world, I believe, in these hourly firm matching products, because we've been having tenders with round-the-clock requirements for 2020. And I think now, since then, almost every conversation you have with a large CNI customer, they're asking for some sort of round-the-clock RTC, because basically environmental reasons for sure, but also just simply people want a firm supply of electricity and they want a financial protection of electricity costs. And hourly matched renewable products in India, they give that assurance to customers. So it's a really exciting place to work because I see this as the next frontier for renewable integration across the world. So it's great. It's great to see this and see that your findings back the potential for what we're seeing on the ground for even more RTC products and firm renewables.
Great, thanks, Matt. And then just lastly, we'll hand it over to Shailesh. Shailesh, if you could just keep it to 1 minute, then that will give us some time to ask you all some more detailed questions.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. Congratulations on the report. I think this is very timely. My reflection on the report is mainly around the conversation around 24/7 CFE in India and other parts of the world. So what we have seen, especially through our work at EnergyTag, is in the European Union and US, 24/7 CFE is basically looked at corporate climate leadership and need for credible carbon reporting and regulatory requirements. However, when you look into India and other Asian markets, the conversation is more around like more pragmatic system-oriented focus, such as like grid reliability, cost-effective integration of renewables and supporting industrial competitiveness, etc. That is the reason this study is very important and very timely in my view, especially 70% CFE, as Irfan just mentioned, can reduce the system-wide cost. And I think this reinforces one of the key important point is like building solar is not enough, like without storage and demand-side flexibility, solar heavy systems can increase the balancing cost, and that's where the role of 24/7 or hourly matching is even more important. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you, Shailesh. If everyone could just turn on their cameras now, and we'll just have, we'll move to the Q&A session. I first want to start by bringing in Vibhuti. So Vibhuti, you've been covering like the Indian market for over a decade now. You're sort of my go-to person whenever I want to understand India, and my question reflects that. So my question for you is, how important is 24/7 CFE in India's current policy landscape? Is it a high priority, or is it sort of seen as something that's more important to some of the other more mature markets in Europe and the US, where we see higher penetration levels of variable renewable energy?
I would, if you just look at how the renewable energy share is changing. So, we have about 48% of total installed capacity, which includes large hydro as well, as per the current numbers. But in terms of generation, the share of renewable energy has gone up to 27-28% now. And also, as you were projecting, like the 2030 goal, India has kind of put a target of 500 gigawatt of renewable energy by 2030. So given the current situation and what India is targeting at, I don't think so the policymaker or the government can shy away that how do we kind of, with such an increasing share of, renewable energy, we really have to make it more reliable and consistent source of supply. So we really need to have this 24/7 CFE. So it's not something I would say the Indian policymakers are pretty cognizant, and it is quite relevant given the current situation. As the other panelists highlighted, that there is a lot of demand from corporates driven by the net zero targets, that they really want to ensure that they are only using the clean energy source alternative. Also, if you will look, the way the Indian tenders have evolved over time. So clearly, the focus initially was more on plain solar, vanilla, and wind contracts to begin with, post 2014, when the auction mechanism was introduced. But 2019 onwards, it's more in terms of reliable source of supply. How do we combine different sources through storage or hybrid, wind solar hybrid, along with energy storage? So that's the kind of tender evolution, and that's where there has been more government being more responsive to meet the buyer's kind of preference, which is now more stable 24/7 clean energy power. So there is a demand, and that's why the policymakers, as I said, have evolved their tender designs, and now we don't see any longer plain vanilla solar or wind contracts. It's wind solar hybrid, or we have now fixed dispatchable renewable energy. So that also kind of addresses, it's not only the annual matching, but they are also ensuring that, on a daily basis, on an hourly basis, they do get more clean energy power. And it's not like limited to, again, annual matching. So I think there already has been a shift, and the new age tenders are reflecting that shift. And yeah, the reasons are more demand from corporates as well as from the grid operators, because otherwise managing the grid becomes increasingly difficult if you just kind of keep putting only solar and wind into the system, and then it's left to the grid operators to manage the grid stability. So these kind of tender designs do address even the grid stability issues.
That's great to know. Matt, I'm now going to come to you. So you and your company are heavily involved in developing clean firm portfolios in India. At TransitionZero, we have a culture of giving feedback. So on that note, I want your honest feedback on the report. Do the report findings reflect what you are seeing on the ground? And in addition to that, in your opinion, what is the most important modeling variable when it comes to understanding the risk of delivering clean firm portfolios?
Great. Thanks, Matt. Look, I think definitely the major findings are something we fully agree on, which is that hourly matching is providing value to customers. And it's here, and we can see that from all of the tenders signed and the way we're going. Everything else is a modeling detail. As you try and model a country as big as India over a huge time frame, then there's always going to be differences in assumptions. But that finding is one which we have, which we're agreed on. I think one main difference is that you've taken a very grid regional approach, which is common to how 24/7 renewables is looked at across the world. Currently, at least in India, there are still a lot of customers which are connected to the national grid, the interstate transmission system, and India is one of the few countries which has little interstate grid congestion. So we still see it possible as being able to serve a real-time load where you have wind in Karnataka and solar in Rajasthan. 10 years from now, there will be a little bit of curtailment, but we think it'll still be on the less material side. And so I don't see there needing to be extreme solutions where, say, a customer in the Northeast needs to just have solar and battery because there's no wind there. Luckily, there's still potential for states to help each other out and transmit that power. Regarding the modeling, I think the biggest learning has been about wind profiles. They change, down on the hourly level so much depending on the site. It's not easy. I think it would be great for, there's a lot more work which the wind WRA wind resource assessment techniques of the world still need to improve. And definitely, I think the key thing is always testing your configurations on operational data. Think about if this happened last year with this site, how would it have worked? And I think you can see a lot of big differences there when you use real operational data, especially for wind.
Yeah, no, great points. And I agree with everything. I see 24/7 CFE is like a journey rather than a destination. And I'm sure that point around wind profiles would have been heard by our product managers who are on the call, who will be looking at that topic very closely going forward. Shailesh, now I'm going to turn to you. So EnergyTag heavily involved in 24/7 advocacy and establishing a marketplace for this new way of accounting. Just want your thoughts on how this conversation around 24/7 differs from the one that we see in the US and the EU. How does it differ in markets like India and wider Asia?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. I think I partially answered that before as well, but as the EnergyTag and through our work around standard policy and market development, we have seen kind of little change over the perception around this, like in the EU and US, 24/7 CFE is mainly around corporate climate leadership, as well as having a more reliable grid, the need of credible carbon reporting, as well as someone just touched base during the presentation around emerging reporting standard as well, such as GHG protocol, etc., and regulatory requirement. And particularly in sectors around data centers, green hydrogen, and also around public procurement as well. But when we look into India and other Asian markets, the focus is mainly around how we can get affordable energy, as Vibhuti also mentioned about this before. So like having access to grid for open access PPAs is like is one of the main factor for corporate PPAs in India, and mainly because of cost difference in what corporations get through the utility or what they get through PPA. That is mainly the cost-based driver. So around like energy security, system efficiency, and like making the whole energy, whole clean energy dispatchable across states or across grid region within the country. These are basically one of the important topics for India and other Asian markets. But we have seen things are changing as well. As we are looking into more around the clock and firm and dispatchable renewable energy coming up in India backed with storage. So this is further changing. And as you rightly pointed out, the impact of reporting standards such as GHG protocol, ISO, etc., that will further drive uptake of more hourly matched energy in future. That's what we see. So both narrative will converge at in few days or months maybe, but this is happening at really faster space.
Great, thank you. We have lots of questions, an overwhelming number of questions. We've tried to answer as many as possible. The questions that we don't get to here, we will follow up afterwards, just to flag that to the attendees. We do have one really good one that I'd like to mention, which is around DISCOMs and the incentives that they have. So DISCOMs, distribution operators. And the question is there a clear incentive for DISCOMs to offer 24/7 CFE services or endorse 24/7 CFE PPAs in general? I'm not sure who's best placed to answer this. Vibhuti, could you have a go?
Sure. I think DISCOMs, given that they have the whole problem of the legacy contracts, having signed PPAs with thermal power and paying the fixed cost to them really adds up to the overall cost, even if renewables have become cheaper now. So they do have an incentive to buy cheaper power and reduce their overall cost of serving of energy demand for various consumers. But the legacy contracts, as well as the new thermal capacity that is being built, are coming from their own central and state generators, and they are already kind of tied up in buying that power. So maybe, yes, fundamentally, yes, but with all the other risks attached with, meeting the fixed costs of the existing PPAs, it's going to take some time for DISCOMs to completely switch to 24/7 CFE.
And Matt and Shailesh, do you have any views on that one as well?
Yeah, so if I just go, I mean, DISCOMs are often the customers for these round-the-clock tariffs. There was an interesting experience we had with, there's one of the SECI tenders, which is the first load following tender, which has recently been signed. And that tender, basically, they set out for every hour of a day for each month, basically the load that needed to be followed. And that load needed to be provided with 80% reliability averaged over each month. And so that load, we were actually involved where the DISCOMs were designing this tender. And so there were a lot of iterations. Okay, should we go 90%? Should we go 70%? Should we go 80%? And okay, thinking about here's the solar that I already have. Here's the kind of demand profile of my customers. How do we create a product and a time match product which works best for us? So it's definitely a solution which is really helpful for DISCOMs, especially since in India, some DISCOMs have bigger portfolios and better capabilities to manage variable renewables than others. And so sometimes it's quite useful to have matched profiles to help them with that management problem to meet their loan.
Shailesh, anything to add there?
No, I think Matt covered it very well. But I just wanted to say that it's actually beneficial for discoms to even come up with 24/7 CFE products. And it all started with green tariffs few years back to serve or to cater the demand from corporations having science-based or net zero targets or RE100 targets. So this is similarly 24/7 CFE products can also help corporations as well to enable their 24/7 claims, as well as help discom to save on their system balancing cost.
Yeah, completely agree with all of those points. We're quickly approaching time. There is another outstanding question in the chat, which is around whether we can expand this analysis to the UK. We will follow up with that person after this webinar. I'd just now like to finish things off, so I'll share my screen again. Here we go. Hopefully everyone can see my screen. So just to recap, we are publishing reports for Japan, Taiwan, Malaysia, and Singapore on the following dates in September. We're also going to be doing a number of roadshows. So we're going to be at the BNEF Summit in India in late August. We're planning to do a roadshow in Japan. We will be at Singapore Energy Week and the ASEAN Energy Business Forum in Malaysia. We would love to see you there. So please do get in touch if you would like to meet with us. And on that note, I just want to thank you all for attending, to thank the panelists for taking the time out of their busy schedules to offer such valuable insights on this report. And last, but certainly not least, Irfan for doing such a good presentation and for staying on time. So on that note, I think we will wrap up there. And thanks again, everyone, for such a great discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.